Sure, although a couple of points. I mean, I want you to tell a story about Hirsi, your cousin, because I think that's a very potent story, really, which speaks to the point that you're making about sexuality. But the other thing is that, I mean, other religions do impose those kind of sexual strictures on people, and you do grow up feeling guilty about your sexuality. Again, I don't mean to sound hung up about being Catholic, but I mean, I do think that, you know, there are some religions that do make you feel kind of hung up about your sexuality. It's not unusual. I mean, they obviously don't go to that extreme, but it's not entirely unusual. But tell us about Hirsi, your cousin.
Yeah.
Who had a very confused idea of her own sexual being.
Absolutely. So on the one hand, my cousin believed that how she was brought up was right and rightful. So she would say things such as, it's right to be a virgin, and condemn other girls for giggling and having affairs, condemn other people's sexuality. On the other hand, she had a boyfriend with whom she had sex, but before she had that boyfriend, she had sex with a number of other men, and the more she thought about herself, the more she condemned herself for the fact that she had lost her virginity. Didn't inform herself about sexually transmitted diseases. Mm-hmm. At one point, she was diagnosed with HIV, and she just carried on having sex without protection with her boyfriend, and she infected him. And at the time that HIV, being seropositive, that transition from being seropositive to having full-blown AIDS, she ends up in an asylum because she can't deal with it and she can't handle it. Now, you can say Catholics and Protestants and maybe Orthodox Jews and whoever else may live under that hang-up. But in the West, you have not only the church that tells you abstain, but you also have the rest of society, a secular society that tells you, if you don't abstain, this is what you do. In Muslim countries, you don't trust the state if it is secular because it's a dictatorship. If it's not secular, then you're living under Sharia law, and having sex is not something you talk about outside of marriage because you could be flogged or stoned or worse. So it doesn't matter no, let me put it differently. It does matter whether you are a Catholic or whether you are a Muslim. Your orthodoxy as a Catholic has been tested and challenged and went through a process of reformation. It has been tamed to the position where if you want to leave it, your society has that separation of church. You have a context where you can defy it
live without repercussion
and lead a meaningful life. Like my cousin Hirsi, you can't. From a tribal Arab society, a tribal Muslim society, where the mechanisms of honor and shame, whether they're enshrined in religion or not, still operate, I think it's very different.
Okay, now, I mean, you know, you've left and you turned your back on Islam in a very dramatic and public way, and you've paid a price because you travel with security guards and your life is constantly under threat, and you have to be, the way you live has changed very much. But when you write, as you did in Nomad on page 201, Islam is not just a belief, it is a way of life, a violent way of life. Islam is imbued with violence and it encourages violence. Now, those words must carry with them responsibility for the offence that they cause. Do you accept that responsibility?
Those words are a description of how Islam is being put into practice today. I make a very clear distinction in the book between Islam as a theology, as a philosophy on the one hand, and Muslims as adherents. And Muslims as adherents are very diverse. You will find a group of Muslims who identify themselves as Muslim in name only. You will find a group of Muslims who follow only the religious dimension. They pray, fast, etc., are not interested in the politics or the social dimension, that is Sharia, regarding the relationship between men and women. You will find Baha'is who have invented a prophet after Muhammad. You will find Sufis who are interested more in the pleasures of life, etc. So there's a great deal of diversity among Muslims. Islamic theology and what it preaches, the concept of jihad, Sharia as a legal system, not questioning the teachings of Muhammad, and the Quran being only a book that you follow and submit to, the rules that are in there. That is the difference. So that is what I am criticizing. And again, I come into Australia. There is a debate about immigration. I look up the number of refugees, displaced peoples, asylum seekers. I find that in the world, there are 40 million people who are fleeing, 40 million in total. Mm-hmm. And they are Christians and Muslims and whatever. 70% of that 40
are Muslims.
Mm. When I talk about violence, that's what I'm referring to. And if you look at what is going on in these countries...
When you say when you're referring to violence...
Well, if you are only 1/5, you compose 1/5 of the world population, but you're responsible for more than 2/3 of the violence in the entire world. And most of that violence is propagated in the name of Islamic theology. And Allah is invoked throughout, Muhammad is invoked throughout. You hear jihad, then there comes a time when we have to stop being politically correct, and especially those of us who are born into Islam come out and say, there is something wrong with the moral system that we grow up with. Some of it is valuable and we ought to keep it, such as hospitality and charity and being nice to your parents. But the other parts, let's not be politically correct about it. And people like you, like the Catholics, what we can learn from you. Now, please let me finish this. What we can learn from you is that those centuries of critical thinking. You know, you Westerners, you take your money to third world countries, you want to be nice, you want to develop. We don't want your money, keep it in your pockets. Share with us your values. And the most important value that I have found in the West the last 18 years is the value of critical thinking. Question authority, whether it's the Quran, whether it's Muhammad, whether it's the Pope, or whether it is, whoever is in charge of this concept building, the Sydney concept building, or the president, or the prime minister. That's what I learned about.
Okay, but let's talk about your solution. Let's talk about because you talk about the principles of enlightenment as being a possible solution to an antidote to the violence of Islam that you have taken exception to. In fact, that we all take exception to, it has to be said. How do you spread the Enlightenment to how many billion Muslims are there in the world? And living in remote places where ignorance and poverty continue to be problems? How do you spread that solution?
First of all, before you start spreading it, you have to change your premise. You have to start with the premise that those 1.57 billion Muslims, 1/5 of the world population, are fellow human beings, are endowed with reason. And that if you are to question their presumptions and their prejudices and their convictions, as individuals, they'll be open to it. Now, don't go to the remotest place in the world, wherever that is that Muslims live. Start with the Muslims living next door. We know in Australia itself that immigrants from Muslim countries, when you add them up today, form probably the largest group. You don't have to go to some remote place in Afghanistan or Somalia. You can start with the Muslim next door. And the way to do it is when the agents of radical Islam, who are financed by countries, Wahhabi countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, come here and set up schools and Muslim centers and institutions where they can indoctrinate, they target Muslim minorities and they can indoctrinate them with the most radical versions of Islam. Instead of seeking to go to remote places, start with them and start challenging them and deny them those institutions and those centers and give them, again, that most important of values, which is critical thinking.
But invariably what happens, I can certainly say in the case of Australia, and in particular in Sydney, there was an instance not very long ago when there was an attempt to open an Islamic school in the western suburbs of Sydney. And there was a division between those who were very, very vocally opposed to the opening of the school because they didn't want those Muslims living amongst us and proselytising amongst us, and those who were very, very, I suppose you would call it politically correct, who were quite libertarian about it and who wanted to protect the sanctity and the ability of these people to actually practice their own faith and teach their own faith in that setting. Mm-hmm. So political correctness is an issue, isn't it? And that would stop people from approaching their next door neighbour and wanting to have a discussion and pose alternate questions, because that's disrespectful.
It's disrespectful to deny people to pray. It's disrespectful to deny people to do something very individual, something that they say I derive pleasure from, that doesn't harm other people. But to establish an institution where you take young children who come mostly from poor countries, and Muslims come mostly from poor countries, and you indoctrinate those young children between the ages of 5 to 18 with ideas such as distance yourself from the infidels. That's the society that they're supposed to integrate into. You indoctrinate young women to believe that they ought to submit to men and to mystify their sexuality, that they can only be son factories, child factories. You indoctrinate young men to give up their lives for jihad or holy war. You teach them to be victims forever because they are taught to believe that as Muslims they are under siege. To discuss that openly and to deny the agents of that intolerant narrative an institution where they can take poor children and indoctrinate them with this nonsense, that is not respect. That is not being disrespectful. That is to say, no, we take these individuals first and foremost as fellow human beings, as Australians, and we are going to teach them what it is to be successful and loyal to the Australian society. And you agents of radical Islam, if you want to live under Sharia law, go to Saudi Arabia, go to Iran, go to some place where Sharia law applies, but you're not going to do it here.
No, I can see why you would say that to the radical imams who preach that, or to the radicalised element of Muslim communities where that is the way they want to live, under a kind of pseudo-Sharia law. However, what do you do? I'm surprised to hear you say that it is possible to approach your Muslim neighbour, just your average, individual, and confront them about elements.
No, not confront them, engage them.
Or engage them.
We live in a reality where we see, I don't know, in Australia, I was told about the Hizb ut-Tahrir conference. Conference/demonstration/ whatever. Hizb ut-Tahrir is an organization that calls America the Great Satan, wants to eradicate Israel, is very intolerant, and seeks to create small groups of militants as potential insurgents within the West. You know that. You know how they go about persuading individuals to take on their message. How do they do it? They knock on people's door. They go to campuses. They go to schools. They target young Muslim people who are vulnerable, and they propagate their message. The rest of us don't do that. We don't engage with the same people. We don't approach them. We don't talk to them. We don't give them an alternative morality, whether it's a spiritual morality like established Christianity, or whether it is the Enlightenment and critical thinking. We just think it's all going to rub off on them. And if we continue to do that, given the demography of the population of Muslims in the world is a lot, and it's very young. So you're going to get more and more immigrants from Muslim countries because Muslim countries are unstable and they have a combination of everything that immigration experts call push factors: instability, crisis, economic crisis, wars, etc. So you'll get more and more people in search of a better life. When they come to Australia or America or Europe, they'll find themselves in a vulnerable position. If the first people and the only people that approach them and get to talk to them are the agents of radical Islam, then they become radicalized. Think about Somalis who were resettled from refugee camps between Ethiopia and Kenya, between Somalia and Kenya, and taken to Minneapolis. And they are radicalized in Minneapolis, and they are going back now to fight with the Shabab. And the Americans are asking themselves, how did this happen? It's because organizations like the Council of American Islamic Relations go there and start propagating about jihad. And these young men engage in jihad. Fast boys, they become young men. Do you want to let that go on, or do you want to engage those people who are brought in here, who have to go through an interview with the immigration and naturalization agencies, who have all kinds of interviews with social work, who go to school? Muslims in the West are continuously, on an everyday basis, they are in touch with the liberal democratic countries and the agencies that they represent. It's just that those agencies are not giving them that alternative message, and they are not making them aware of the fact that they have been targeted by radical Islamic agents for something else other than coming to these countries to build for themselves a better life.
And is this what you do in America? Are you engaging with young Muslims?
I engage with young Muslims. Wherever I speak, they get to ask me questions and I talk to them. But by the time I engage with them, I find that it's too late. I've been to American universities where young people have been radicalized to a point where it's almost impossible to converse with them because they have these almost like pre-recorded messages that they just drawn out. But that surprises me in a country like America, and by the way, in a country like Australia, Canada, and the European countries. You think, what on earth was going on in school? What on earth was going on when these young people were growing up? Why hasn't anyone reached out to them before that? The answer I get is because we respect their religion. If they want a prayer space, we give it to them. If someone comes in preaching Islam, we say, we respect your religion. Hey, harvest.
Okay. Now, I could sit here and chat to you all night long, but I'm aware that everybody else wants to ask you a few questions. I'm sure there are people who want to ask you a few questions, and there's already hands shooting up, so I'm going to hand over to the audience. And we'll do it in an orderly fashion, and we'll have questions rather than statements. I think would probably be the way to go tonight. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Yes.
Are you at, well, we live in a pluralistic society that allows religious schools. We have many Christian schools, Jewish schools. How can we possibly forbid Muslim schools by allowing these other schools?
Yeah. That's a very good question. I'm going to repeat the question. The question is, we live in a pluralistic society. How can we possibly allow Christian schools and Jewish schools to carry forth and ban Muslim schools? We can if we have a good argument for it. And the good argument is, and I think when I was a legislator in the Netherlands, I started out with that question. And the opposition asked, but we have Christian schools, therefore we should allow Muslim schools. But I knew how bad Muslim schools were for Muslim kids and for the society and for our stated goal and purpose in the Netherlands of assimilating Muslims as quickly as possible. The first conclusion that I came to was, okay, fine, let's change the constitution so that there'll be no Christian schools and there'll be no Jewish schools. Pretty soon I realized that was unrealistic. And you are laughing, but you know, one of the reasons why it was unrealistic was most of the Christian schools really were Christian only in name. They have become kind of private elite schools, and they wanted to keep out immigrants, Muslim immigrants, who do not meet the requirements for an elite school where you need parents to be very, very involved in the education of the children. So one way of having these Christian schools was to keep out Muslim kids. And that would have been a good reason to ban Christian schools. But I realized that that was very unrealistic. Philosophically, it is still possible, and I think practically, to come to the conclusion that a society that came forth out of a history, Judeo-Christian history, and that culture, part of it the Enlightenment culture, part of it still vaguely Christian, vaguely Jewish, that if you apply the argument of cultural legitimacy, it is okay to allow the Judeo-Christian culture, to be there while you ban Muslim schools, because Islam is not just alien in the sense that it is a different religion. I wouldn't ban Muslim schools if Muslim schools were like any other school, except that children prayed and fasted and were taught the Islamic religious symbols. My argument for banning Muslim schools is the teaching that they are different, that they are alien, grooming them in Sharia, grooming them to reject the values of the country that they've come to live in. That would be the philosophical argument. But there's also another argument. I don't know about Australia, but in the Netherlands, the government had a stated purpose to assimilate immigrants as fast as possible. In a Muslim school, who sends their children to Muslim schools? Muslim parents. Most of them of a lower social income and of a lower education. Is it fair to those children to isolate them in that way? Is it fair to them? No. If we wanted to reach our stated goal, our stated purpose of assimilating getting them absorbed into society as fast as possible, then we needed to spread them out to the different schools. And having Muslim schools wasn't a part of that. Then there's the third argument, that there is a worldwide jihadi movement, of which the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt provides the ideology, Saudi Arabia provides the money, that are targeting those communities that are very vulnerable. That third alien argument also says no to Muslim schools, because Christian schools and Jewish schools are not affected in that way. So given all of these arguments, knowing that the argument is not 100% consistent, but still weighing the pros and the cons, I would go for a banning of Muslim schools in the interest of those children and in the interest of society. And these are interests that are threatened by those three factors that I've given you that do not apply to Jewish and Christian schools. Yeah. So for those of you sitting back there, the question is, am I aware of the fact that there is a booklet in Australia called Learning from Each Other, that, and I hear from another audience member, whitewashes the negative aspects of Islam. And the question I asked is the intention to Islamize Australia? And there were a few giggles there. I know of many attempts by organized Muslim groups to reach out to the government and to society. I don't know much about Australia, but in the UK, other European countries, the Netherlands, the United States, that have a campaign of telling Western populations, Islam is a religion of peace. It's a religion like any other. Please don't confuse it with Al-Qaeda and extremism and everything else that you read about in the news that these jihadis want. Personally, I would be very, very suspicious of such booklets and such attempts. Why? Because there is no way to deny that Islam has a religious aspect, and that there are many Muslims, most Muslims, in fact, in the West, who abide only by the religious dimension of Islam. But what these booklets seek to do is they seek to cover up the other parts of Islam that are under debate. And the other parts of Islam that are under debate are the political dimension of Islam and the social dimension of Islam. The political dimension of Islam, again, central to that is the concept of jihad and Sharia law, and relevant to Western countries on the social dimension is the introduction, mostly through arbitration laws and mediation laws, aspects of Sharia regarding family law, and that will deny many women their rights. So that is why I am in opposition to such pamphlets and such PR campaigns to paint the whole of Islam in bright colors, where I would say I would reserve the bright colors only for the religious spiritual dimension of Islam, And I would be very, very wary and very critical of the political and religious dimension of Islam. And if these pamphlets don't contain that information, then they are bogus.
Ayaan, thank you very, very much. That was fabulous. We're going to talk to them there. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're very right.